Hi, sorry for the late introduction. I'm Laura, the girl who's been visiting an empty grave for 31 years, just for the grave owner to come herself visit me. If you haven't seen the first part, you might want to go check it out before continuing this one. So without further ado, here's part 2. The lie inside the lie. I didn't sleep that night. Nora stayed in my guest room. It felt impossible to let her leave. Like if she walked out that door, she might dissolve back into the impossible, and I'd wake up to find none of it had happened. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, and I did what I always do when something is too large to hold. I made a list. What I knew, what I didn't know, what I needed to find out. What I knew, my twin sister was alive. She had been adopted at birth. My parents knew. They had constructed a story, a grave, a photo, a cause of death, and maintained it for 3 decades without a single crack. What I didn't know, why? That was the only item on that list that mattered. Not how, not when, not by whom specifically. Why? What could possibly make 2 people look at their newborn daughter and decide she needed to disappear? What I needed to find out. Everything. Over the next 2 weeks, Nora and I became, out of necessity, investigators. She had a head start. 6 months of searching had already given her a foundation. The adoption agency, now closed, but with records still held by the state, had given her limited information. Biological parents' names, general medical history, the date and location of the adoption. What it hadn't given her was the reason. Adoption records from that era, 31 years ago, were sealed tighter than almost anything else. Private adoption, handled through a lawyer rather than a state agency, which meant even less transparency and even more deliberate obscurity. Someone had paid for that obscurity. Someone had specifically chosen a process that would be hard to trace. My father is a doctor. He had money and connections and a very clear understanding of how to make paperwork disappear. We started with what we could access: birth records, hospital records from the facility where we were born. I filed a request. As a biological party, I had standing, and 2 weeks later received a document that told me more in 3 pages than my parents had told me in 31 years. 2 live births, both healthy, both full term, no complications, no fatalities. A standard delivery with a standard outcome. Clara Ann Mercer, the name on the headstone, the name I had been grieving, appears nowhere in that hospital record. Because she was never Clara. She was baby B, discharged 2 days after birth into the custody of a private attorney acting on behalf of an adoptive family. Healthy, perfect, alive. Here's what Nora found while I was processing the birth records. She had been digging into our father's history, his career, his finances, the timeline of his life around the year we were born, and she found something that at first seemed unrelated. 32 years ago, 1 year before we were born, our father was the subject of a medical board complaint, a serious one. A patient had died under circumstances that raised questions. The complaint was eventually dismissed, but the process had been brutal. 18 months of investigation, his reputation hanging by a thread, his career almost destroyed before it had fully begun. The person who filed that complaint, who pushed it, who kept it alive for 18 months, was a man named Robert Calloway. Nora found this and didn't immediately understand why it mattered. Then she found something else. Robert Calloway is her adoptive father. I need you to sit with that for a moment. The man who nearly destroyed our father's career. The man who filed the complaint that hung over our family like a cloud for 18 months. That man raised my sister. That is not a coincidence. That is an exchange. We don't have proof of what was said or agreed to. We may never have proof of the specific conversation, the specific terms, the specific moment 2 men looked at each other and decided that a newborn child was a reasonable thing to trade. But the shape of it is clear enough. Robert Calloway had power over our father. Real power. The kind that ends careers and dismantles carefully constructed lives. And somehow, in the year after that complaint was dismissed, Robert Calloway and his wife, who had been struggling to adopt for years, whose application through standard channels had been repeatedly denied, suddenly found themselves with a healthy newborn daughter. Our father's debt was cleared. The complaint stayed dismissed. And somewhere a grave was built for a girl who didn't need one. I called my mother on a Wednesday afternoon. I didn't tell her what I knew, not yet. I just called, the way I always call, and I listened to her voice. Warm, familiar, the voice that read me bedtime stories and talked me through heartbreaks and called every Sunday without fail for 31 years. And I tried to find in it some trace of the woman who did this. I couldn't find it. That's the thing about people who are capable of tremendous cruelty. They don't sound like it. They sound like your mother. They sound like Sunday phone calls and I love yous and white flowers on a grave that should never have existed. I told her I was thinking of coming home to visit. She said she'd make my favorite dinner. I hung up and sat very still for a long time. Nora and I met every day that week, in person when we could, on video call when we couldn't. We were building something, a shared understanding of a story that belonged to both of us, but neither of us had been given. And somewhere in those days of coffee and documents and long silences and longer conversations, something else was being built too. I know it sounds impossible. Two strangers with the same face, thrown together by a lie, trying to construct a relationship out of nothing but biology and circumstance. But here's what I discovered about my sister in those 2 weeks. She laughs exactly the way I laugh. The same rhythm, the same timing, the same tendency to laugh at things that aren't quite appropriate. She holds her coffee cup with both hands. She talks with her hands when she's passionate about something. She cries at commercials and is embarrassed about it. She has the same habit I have of going completely quiet when she's angry rather than raising her voice. She is in every way that matters, the person I would have become if I had grown up in a different house. She is also entirely herself in ways that have nothing to do with me. Her career, her marriage, her friendships, the specific texture of her humor, all of it shaped by a life I wasn't part of. She is familiar and foreign at the same time, and spending time with her is the strangest, most wonderful, most heartbreaking thing I have ever experienced. By the end of that second week, she wasn't a stranger with my face, she was my sister. And that made what we were about to do much harder, and completely necessary. We decided together that we would confront our parents. Not over the phone, not in a letter, in person, in the house where I grew up, at the dinner table where my mother had already promised to make my favorite meal. I would arrive as planned. Nora would arrive unannounced, and for the first time in 31 years, our family would all be in the same room. I think I'll stop here for today. The next part should be the final one. If you like my storytelling or have any comments to share, please don't hesitate. Catch you later.